You're watching Shalom TV, celebrating all things Jewish.
Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present Chayim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and on this edition of Chayim, I have the chance to welcome back a dear friend and someone you've come to know very well here on Shalom TV, Isi Leibler. I should say, incidentally, that we are coming to you in a sort of unorthodox fashion. Our offices, as Isi has arrived, lost all power. We were affected first by Hurricane Sandy, and now we're affected by a storm today. And so extraordinary technicians here at Shalom TV have set up an ability for us to meet really in sort of a common area. And I thank you for being so patient and nice about this. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Just to remind you a little bit about Isi Leibler, he is one of world Jewry's foremost leaders, one of the most creative and dynamic individuals on the world Jewish scene. For years and years and years, Isi lived in Australia and headed Australian Jewry and was instrumental in many things that went on as a result. One of the things he was very much involved with was really opening up the way for Soviet Jewry ultimately to be freed. And it was Isi who did extraordinary work with Soviet Jewry, brought it to the attention of the United Nations General Assembly before anybody was doing so in the Jewish world. He also did remarkable work, and Isi, you and I have never talked about this on camera, but Isi did remarkable work establishing dialogue and opening up relationships with the Jewish world's connection to Asia and to China. And I think you were responsible for creating the first Jewish cultural event in Beijing.
Yes.
In 1992 or something like that. And then in 1999, Isi fulfilled the dream and made Aliyah, his entire large family of children and grandchildren. How many grandchildren now?
17. Yeah.
17 grandchildren. And do they all live in Israel?
All except one group, yeah.
Okay, so many of your children and grandchildren live in Israel, and you live in Jerusalem. And Isi writes from Jerusalem a wonderful column, at least weekly, sometimes even more than weekly, called Candidly Speaking from Jerusalem. And I believe it has now become one of the leading columns in the Jewish world as a thoughtful centrist who tries to analyze what's going on not only in the state of Israel but in the Jewish world as a whole. And it's produced out of wordforjerusalem.com. And at the end of our meeting today, I'm going to remind you of how you can subscribe. I receive every one of his columns by email, and I really encourage all of you to do so as well. Thank you again for going out of your way on this stormy, stormy day to meet with us.
Again, my pleasure, Mark.
Well, we're meeting, as it turns out, the day after the 2012 presidential election, and as Israel is anticipating its own elections. So let's begin with the political scene and how it affects world Jewry, the state of Israel. You have written columns prior to this election, sometimes critical of the current administration of Barack Obama. And there are Jews who said to me, Isi, oh, it will be terrible for Israel if Barack Obama is reelected. From your vantage point, as you look at the American political landscape, and now we have Barack Obama for another 4 years, are you concerned? And if you are, what level of concern do you have? And we'll discuss what I hear people say on both sides of the issue, and there were many American Jews who are very enthusiastic about Barack Obama. But as you see the American elections and as they have turned out, and you were watching them carefully last night from your own hotel, what do you feel about it?
Look, I share the view of most Israelis that we saw in the last administration, certainly in the first half of the last administration, manifestations of and acts that we considered were not very favorable to us. There is no doubt that the majority of Israelis were not pro-Obama because there had been tensions and pressures. I myself am an optimist and believe whatever may have been, we have to take an extraordinarily positive attitude. We've got to go on board with what President Obama said in the last 6 months, and particularly in the last 3 months and 3 weeks. And as long as he stands by to an extent, and I know that all politicians have a tendency to kind of forget about their commitments when they're elected, but as long as he stands by the broad thrust, then I feel that this great democratic country of the United States will still remain on side. But if you ask me whether I have reservations and concerns, of course I have reservations and concerns, because there were aspects to his policy that I considered very threatening to us.
Many people have pointed out to me that there are Israelis, very high-ranking Israelis, in government and also within the military, the IDF, who have said that what Barack Obama did, his administration did, in terms of military and intelligence cooperation between the United States and Israel, the word they use, Izzy, is unprecedented, that it has never been as close an alliance militarily and in terms of the sharing of intelligence as has been true. People point out to me that when there was the incident in the Israeli embassy in Cairo, and when it was stormed by a certain kind of mob mentality, Barack Obama was called by Netanyahu and immediately responded and did help get the Israeli diplomats out of Cairo. They cite the extraordinary speech he gave at the United Nations when the Palestinians were trying for statehood there. And I don't think there's ever been a better speech by an American president than that one for Israel, and you and I have talked about that in the past. And that these kinds of things are seen by those who support the president and as evidence of the fact that the kind of worry that Israelis have, and we've seen the polls there as well, is misplaced. How do you balance the positives that are cited by an Ehud Barak and others in the Israeli establishment who claim that the president, in fact, indeed, setting the early Cairo speech aside, setting aside his comments about Israeli settlements are a major obstacle to peace, and there must be all cessation of any kind of settlement growth, even in Jerusalem. But if one says, okay, those may have been mistakes in the early part of his administration, the overall Obama administration has been very pro-Israel. And what's your reaction to that?
Mark, I want to be positive. The day after an election and a new American president has been elected, I don't want to be pouring any kind of cold water over the overall situation. But we have to be very realistic. And what you say, and I've said this myself, the security relationship between the United States and Israel has been superb and ongoing and improved more so during this administration than before. And the second factor that you referred to, his speech at the United Nations, I regarded that as one of the most pro-Israel speeches that any American administration and any American president's ever given. Now, what I have to balance against that is my concern if he goes back on a number of issues that were part of American policy. One of those is the 67 borders plus swaps. I don't believe there's a possibility of swaps with the present PA, because even if he wanted to, and I believe that he speaks with a forked tongue and is highly duplicitous,
He being
Mahmoud Abbas, even if he wanted to, he couldn't. So we're left with a situation where 67 borders, and I can say to you, living in Israel, those 67 borders are indefensible and will put Israel at prey put us in an extraordinarily difficult position. So if he goes back to that sort of thing, it worries me, and I'm praying he doesn't, because he may have learned and seen there's been a lot of things, a lot of water's gone down the bridge since then. The second area which worries me about him, but I want to think positively, so I'm not saying this as anything other than a concern, is his overall policy towards the Islamic revival, because to me there's a major misunderstanding. To say that the threat comes from Al-Qaeda is nonsense. To say that the threat comes from the Salafists, which are more radical than the Muslim Brotherhood, is also misleading. The threat to me comes from the Muslim Brotherhood. And if an American administration considers that it's going to come to terms with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an evil organization based on hatred against Jews and Christians and all infidels, an organization which is ultimately committed to the destruction of the Jewish state, I'm hoping that President Obama will not go soft and try to engage too much, but will show them the line. He has, to his credit, said that he has insisted every time to Morsi that he must retain the Israel-Egyptian peace treaty. Now, he's going to be under pressure not to do that. The other area...
I'm sorry, which he?
President Obama is going to be under pressure to go softly on the Egyptians and the Muslim Brotherhood. And I hope that he does not go back and backtrack.
Who's putting the pressure on him? What's your guess?
There's elements within the Democratic Party, which is something I hope we get a chance to talk about. I say elements, not the Democratic Party. There are elements within the Democratic Party that have adopted a third world attitude towards Israel, regarding Israel as a colonial implant and regarding Israel in the most negative terms. These elements inside the Democratic Party are pushing very, very hard for the president and the administration to take tougher attitudes against Israel and to go back to the times when there were difficulties between both parties. I can assure you of one thing. Bibi Netanyahu, who will probably be re-elected, whatever the outcome comes, is committed to the American alliance and recognizes that whatever differences there were in the past, Israel must come to terms and must have a good relationship with this administration. And I have no doubt that he will pursue this path. But if you ask me whether I have concerns, I've expressed those concerns. I'm also concerned. He has said marvelous things about Iran. Never on my watch will they become nuclear. Now we have to remind him of that, and I pray that he stands by that. If he stands by that and stops Iran from becoming nuclear, he will make a difference to the world. He'll make a difference to the United States, to Europe, to Israel, and to the Arab world in particular. Because if they go nuclear, it's going to become an extraordinary, difficult situation. And I also hope, as I said earlier, that he will stand up against Islamic fanaticism. And Islamic fanaticism is not Al-Qaeda. You have within the framework of what's taking place in this revival, in the Arab Spring, you have Islamic fanatics. And they've got to be identified, because appeasing these people is counterproductive. It undermines the moderates and the decent Muslims. So those are my concerns. But having said those concerns, I say that apart from other considerations, America is a democracy. Public opinion towards Israel has never been higher in this country. Congress is good towards Israel, and a president is ultimately a reflection of the people in a democracy. And this being a democracy, I'm confident that whatever differences, and there would have been differences with Romney, because some Israelis were euphoric, because even if Romney would have won, we would still have our problems with him, as we had with other Republican administrations in the past. But I believe that everybody will be making an effort, and I pray to God that that effort will be rewarded and it will get back on track, and that the ugly differences that occurred will remain in the background and we continue on the path of the last 6 months.
There are many American Jews, very well-meaning, extraordinarily ethical people, who sometimes worry that the United States will fall into a pattern of Islamophobia, and that there will be, in some way, subtle and then not so subtle persecution of American Muslims, who will be tarred with some kind of association, simply by being Muslim, with what we might call the extreme Muslim fanatic expressed, as you described, by the Muslim Brotherhood. And therefore there's almost a Jewish resistance, an American Jewish resistance, to describing the threat that comes out of this extreme Muslim ideology with the word Muslim. There's almost a conscious effort never to use the word Muslim or Islamic in reference to the threat you're saying exists and is aimed at the Western world in general, Israel and the United States in most particular. Could you speak for a moment about how you feel about the Jewish sensitivity to the American Muslim community and this desire not to create a sort of kind of bigotry against Muslims in America, and whether that in any way works against an honest awareness of where the threat really is coming from at this point in time?
Look, in my opinion, there is an absolute imperative for Jews to identify Islamic fundamentalist extremism for what it is and say so explicitly. And not fall into the trap that the administration has got into of not even using the word Muslim in relation to terrorism, which to my mind, if you ask me for another critique of the previous administration, I think this is wrong. We want to build up moderate Muslims. There are moderate Muslims, particularly in the United States. And in the United States, they have an opportunity of doing much more than in some of those totalitarian countries in which they're in. And it's terribly important for Jewish groups to reach out to these people, make them feel that they have allies, that the Jewish community is their ally, that we are not prejudiced against Muslims per se, we are prejudiced against the Islamic element of extremism, which has manifested itself, unfortunately, in so many countries in the Muslim world. Is extremism which we are making a big mistake in suppressing. Some of the barbaric customs that are taking place in those areas. I mean, the stoning for adultery of women, the homophobia, and many of these other things. I mean, what sort of Jewish liberals are they if they say we've got to be concerned about these things? They seem to be terribly concerned about same-sex marriages in the United States, which is they're entitled to be, but somehow or other, when these abominations of a negative sort are within the Muslim Islamic framework, will be accused of Islamophobia, as you put it, by saying it. Nonsense. You are strengthening decent Muslims by identifying the extremism. And when it comes to Islamophobia, you have to look at anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and ask yourself a few questions. And unfortunately, although Jews are a much smaller minority in most parts of the world than Muslims, the anti-Semitism is a greater threat than Islamophobia, and they should not fall into the trap. We should fight with Muslims against prejudice. We should fight against genuine Islamophobia. But to fight against Islamophobia, we have to show certain principles and stand up and be counted when they do bad things to other people. And they do a lot of bad things to other people.
Mm-hmm. You do not have any hesitation in using the word Muslim or Islamic extremism.
Absolutely not. As I would with regard to Jews. I see Jewish extremism. I don't put it in the same category because we don't have many Jews running around killing. But Jewish extremism is a threat within the Jewish framework and the Jewish. And one of the things that I think we're combating in Israel is elements of Jewish extremism that may emerge. There is no comparison, however, and they should not be bracketed together because we're not out there killing. Our Jewish extremists may mouth stupid, radical, ugly things, but they may even indulge in desecrations and they should be put in jail and put away in their abominations. But first of all, the overwhelming majority of Jews, every time something like this comes up, condemns them. Mm-hmm. And we complain that the police are not tough enough with them. So, on the other hand, you have a look at what's going on in the Islamic world, where some of the worst monsters of the last 50 years are being sanctified as martyrs. Squares are named after them. The families of suicide bombers receive pensions. I mean, all of these are things we should speak up about. That's not Islamophobia. That's fighting for justice and for ethics.
Is it an Islamic mentality itself, or is it a general Arab mentality? In other words, what I hear some American Jews say is that, yes, there are bad things that are going on in Arab societies, but it's not the Muslim religion that's at fault, and therefore one should be careful not to use the word Muslim or Islamic, thereby suggesting to people that the Muslim religion itself somehow leads to this, or that the Islamic mentality is such that by being a member of the Islamic community, you are in some way, some subtle way, also guilty of these kinds of acts and attitudes.
To say that it's an Arab mentality is, to my mind, outright racism. To say that Islam is, by its very definition, extremist is outrageous. But Islam, Judaism, and Christianity have within them humanistic, universalistic streaks, and also have extremism. And the way religions are interpreted determines whether they're going to be humanistic or otherwise. And unfortunately, the dominant elements in many Islamic states reflect the negative side, an extremist side of Islam rather than the moderate one. And to fight and give courage and strength to the people that are trying to resist this, we should stand up and be counted and say so, and not look away from confronting reality. Confronting reality is the only way we will overcome this situation. And running away from it because we can be accused of being prejudiced is nonsense.
You know, there was an ad placed in the New York subway system. Did you hear about this ad in which a distinction was made between civilized man and jihadists? And the ad ultimately said, in a choice, always choose the civilized man, help protect the state of Israel, defeat jihad.
Look, I don't like this advertisement because it is primitive and simplistic. But there is nothing wrong in identifying what I would describe as the extremist element within. But it's got to be done with sophistication and intelligence. And you do not want to cater for the baser instincts of human beings by being primitive about these matters. But to say that a society which, for example, sanctifies killers, that is a savage society, is neither racist nor incorrect. It's true. But it has to be explained in an intelligent and rational manner, so you're not just bucketing a whole nation or a whole religion per se. But the fact is that there is savagery in this context, not because of the religion, but because of the people that are controlling that religion and are moving it towards an extremist factor.
I want to know your attitude about Baruch Goldstein. Baruch Goldstein took a machine gun into a mosque in Hebron, actually, Cave of Machpelah, and he killed a number of Muslim worshippers at this mosque. And ultimately, he was killed as a result by the mob who responded. But I want to know what you say about Baruch Goldstein.
I say that he is a deranged lunatic, did terrible, evil things, and, you know, his name is a terrible burden on the Jewish people, his memory. And you've got a few lunatics that worship him, but I can assure you that 99.9% of decent Israelis everywhere and of Jews everywhere regard him in those terms.
Come back now to a reference you made to the Democratic Party. There was the recognition that certain items in the 2008 Democratic platform relating to Israel were not present in the 2012 platform. And one had to do with a reference to Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And there was an attempt to put that back into the platform in a plenum session. And there were, when this was brought to the floor of the Democratic Convention, audible, not only audible, palpable, there was the
Yes.
presence of boos that was startling to observers. I've had people say to me that it was a failure of the Democratic leadership. When you're going to do something on the floor of a convention, you make sure the convention is packed with those who support whatever you're going to do. But there was seemingly a real resistance with these no's to the notion of Jerusalem being put into the platform. And there are people who feel that there is, I'm now using your word, an element within the Democratic Party that is, quote, far left and sees Israel as guilty of things that approach racism and apartheid.
Yes.
I just want you to sort of comment from your own perspective on what you see as the overall context of the Democratic Party, and share with us the extent to which you feel this should be not upsetting to Israelis, but what should the American Jew, how should the American Jew look at and see this element within the Democratic Party, and what does it say about the Democratic Party as a whole?
I saw that I saw it on television. That it was chilling to hear those, as you say, palpable boos when Israel's name, and it was not just Jerusalem. There were other aspects of the program which had favourable references to Israel that were also deleted. In my opinion, there is an extraordinary obligation on the part of the Jewish community, which is overwhelmingly democratic, which overwhelmingly stood by President Obama, to the surprise of many people from outside, overwhelmingly stood by. Now they have to make use of the fact that they stood by the president, that they stood by the Democratic Party, and make sure that that party goes back to its true sources and origins, which have always been positive towards Israel. Because the greatest threat I see to Israel today is not that the Democrats become anti-Israeli, but that any party becomes anti-Israeli, and that bipartisanship is undermined. Because the soundest element has been in the US-Israel relationship that come what party, come what tensions there may be, and there'll always be tensions and differences, by and large, bipartisanship and the general attitude towards Israel reflects the values of the American people. And if the Democratic Party moves in the direction that it started to move, it would be a catastrophe, both for Jews in the Democratic Party, because ultimately they would discover that when you're violently anti-Israel, it leads to other anti-things. They will not find themselves comfortable in that party the way they are. They play an important role. They supported the president and the administration and the party. Now I hope they will use and capitalize on the fact that they stood by him to see that these rogue elements are driven out or outside of the mainstream. And that's terribly important. To me, it's the biggest threat. It's central to the future of the American Jewish community's relationship to Israel.
Okay, now come to the politics of Israel.
Yep.
You spoke when there was this mega coalition that existed for what seems like a moment in time. You were optimistic, and then you were disappointed. And
Deeply.
Okay. And now there seems to be a new coalition brewing between Avigdor Lieberman and Netanyahu. How do you assess it? What do you think is going to happen? Does it please you? Does it worry you? What?
It worries me. It worries me to the extent that I don't think that either party is going to gain from it. All that will be achieved will be an assurance that whatever conceivable combination of parties join up in competition will not get the majority, because I think that's what's motivated them. They're worried that one party could perhaps get one more vote, and in the present constellation, the president might be inclined to hand over and say, you form a government. I think that was the motivation. I see major differences between Likud and Yisrael Beitenu. I see Likud has a left wing and a right wing, has a liberal wing and a right wing. Yisrael Beitenu,
which is Avigdor Lieberman's party.
Avigdor Lieberman is a different sort of a party. It's more hardline. It has a kind of a Russian approach towards things, and there are reasons to question whether this is going to ultimately be to the beneficiary of Israel. You have to understand that Lieberman himself is an extremely bright fellow. But he,
do you know him?
Yes. I don't say I know him well, but...
But you've met him.
He's extremely bright, not to be underestimated, but he has a tendency of, even when he's right, of speaking at the wrong moment at the wrong time. And I'm just hoping that the contradictions between him and the Prime Minister that used to take place, I mean, the Prime Minister would make a statement, he'd go to the United Nations and say the opposite. Even if he's right, and sometimes he was right, that's not the way for a government to work. I think they're looking in the long term, but this is not going to be a government of one party. I'm still hopeful that this is going to be a broad coalition, because a broad coalition is critical. I see the Labour Party coming back with a big bang. I think Shelley Yachimovich is going to be the number one victor out of all the changes that have taken place.
Why?
For two reasons. First of all, because Kadima has been an utter and absolute catastrophe. Everything they've touched, I thought they reached their depths under Tzipi Livni, but after her successor, Shaul took over, Mofaz took over, they went even deeper. And the stuff, he's not a bad fellow, but the rubbish which he comes with in statements and in opposition don't make the Israeli public take him seriously. Whereas Shelley Yachimovich has what I would call a simplistic social policy.
And he's the new leader of Labour.
Leader of Labour. And she has a fairly simplistic manner of conveying it. I mean, I don't share her views. I think they're too simplistic, and I think it would be bad for Israel. But as an opposition and as an alternative party, I like her because she's bringing back Zionism into the Labour Party. And where you had these young left-wing post-Zionist elements that took the whole Zionism out of Labour Zionism, she's bringing it back. And even her attitude towards government is a positive one. She will support Netanyahu on what she thinks is correct. She went to France. She strongly supported his policy on Iran. She's spoken out publicly in relation to the settlements. She may be against them, but she reminds her party that these are all decent people. These are the people we put in office, and we should be humble and recognize the fact that this is a human tragedy if and when they are displaced. So she's a different type of person. She brings a new, fresh blood. Then you've got Lapid, who comes in,
Lapid,
who is a very fascinating character. He has absolutely no political experience, none whatsoever, but I would say that he's going to get quite a bunch of votes, anything between 6 to even 15, probably more, 6 to 10.
And his party is named?
Yesh Atid.
There is a future.
Yes.
And you say about him?
I say that where he has no political experience, there's a healthiness in the sense that he truly represents and reflects vox populi of many people, and people like him. He's a nice fellow.
He's charismatic too.
Very charismatic. And look, I knew his father, and his father was different because his father was violently anti-religious, but anti-religious to a point of, he really hated Haredim. This guy is got as a major platform to make adjustments to the Haredi world life so that they become part and parcel of civic life in Israel, that they become productive elements in the economy, that they serve in the army, not overnight, but properly. Now, to have someone like that is good. It's a yeast. And he'll come in, I'm sure he'll come in to a Netanyahu government if he has enough votes, and he will push them on. Because one of the most important things they have to do, this government, in addition to the great threats that they're going to face externally, there are social issues within Israel that must be confronted. The first of all is the Haredi issue, which is really tearing people apart. And the whole of the rabbinate, the extremism which has captured the rabbinate, is something horrific. The chief rabbinate today is no longer comparable to the chief rabbinate of the old days, which was an attempt to unify people and to bring people towards religion. They're alienating people because they are trying to be more extreme and more stringent in their interpretation than ever before. So you have these problems with conversion, you have these problems with marriage, you have these problems with attitudes towards the army, even in terms of kashrut sometimes. You have a lot of decent rabbis that want to express themselves in a positive way, like the Tzohar group, and hopefully they will get a chance. But Bibi Netanyahu is very much under the influence of the Haredim.
How did that happen?
Because they had the leverage. They could make or break governments. And unless he's going to have a wider coalition, they can exert excessive leverage. And they're a one-dimensional party. They're only interested in their own religious interests and the interests of their constituents. And they're not a healthy element in that context, because they're alienating people, more alienating people from religion rather than bringing them towards it.
Has the average Israeli had enough?
Yes, he has. But he has
This is new, isn't it?
Well,
for many years, when I was in Israel,
they've been griping. They griped about it. But
many
today,
Israelis just didn't care. Now they seem to care.
I believe that if he doesn't do something about the Haredi problem, that he will find a revolt and he will lose votes.
To Netanyahu?
Yeah. And that's why I think Yesh Atid and Lapid are a good factor to push this on.
Mm-hmm. You know, the way it's described, again, within the American community and even among some Israelis, is that Netanyahu is much too far right, and that this represents something about Israel that American Jews don't like. We want a liberal, left-leaning government, and Netanyahu is just, in some way, far too warlike, intransigent, and again to the right. Is that what you feel is a dominant view of him within Israel?
If that was a dominant view about him in Israel, he would not be the prime minister.
No, it would if that were if that showed where Israelis were. In other words, part of the argument is that the fact that Netanyahu is so popular indicates the extent to which the Israeli people, as a people, have moved to the right.
I think that Oslo created an enormous chasm in Israel's society. You had the proponents of the greater Israel, of appropriating everything, and you had those that want to move right back to everything. Today there's a much more sensible Israel. There's no greater Israel other than the ultra-right, and the mad left is marginalized, and the vast majority of the people are looking for a centrist, intelligent, rational way. We don't want to rule over Arabs, but my goodness, if our security is at stake, no more unilateral concessions, no more handing over territories which are going to be used as vehicles from which to launch more missiles against us. That is not being illiberal, that's not being right, that's being, pardon the expression, bloody sensible. And I share that view, and I think to the extent that Netanyahu has moved his own party, Likud, to the center, he's done the very opposite of what people
That's interesting.
Claim. He has moved Likud to the center. I hope he doesn't move back now with Lieberman. But Lieberman himself is very pragmatic, very unpredictable. You don't know where he's going to go. And he can be he can move very quickly and change positions if he feels that it's politically astute.
Expedient. Are you suggesting that the word centrist should be used with the Netanyahu administration?
Yes. Well, when you say Netanyahu administration, I'm saying not the Netanyahu administration, but the people in the center are the mainstay of the Netanyahu administration. They're the backing of it. You will find that most people go along, even people who don't like Netanyahu, because there are a lot of people who don't like him personally or had some axe to grind, but he stands so far, head and shoulders above any other politician. And Ehud Olmert, who I knew for a long, long time, was very close to him at one stage. I think it's disgraceful the way he's behaving, because for a former prime minister to come out and say the things that he says about this existing government, and to allege, knowing fully well it's not true, that he nearly had Abbas at the point of making a peace settlement, is just so much nonsense. and he'd actually given everything away, and he still could not extract a plus yes from Mahmoud Abbas.
By the way, it's amazing to me that Olmert has risen from the political ashes. And he seems to all of a sudden be even a darling of some on the liberal side of the Jewish spectrum.
There's a desperation for someone to stand against Netanyahu. There's no personalities. I mean, compared to Mofaz, he's still a genius. And he hasn't got, you know, there's nobody around.
You know, when Nixon left office for the first time, he said, well, you won't have me to kick around anymore. I had the feeling that was what Livni was saying as she was leaving Kadima. But she seems almost, she's ready now to have a political resurrection herself, yes?
Yes, but I think you'll find that their voting, the votes will not go heavily their way. They'll pick up some anti-Netanyahu votes, but I don't think that they've got a great future.
Again, given the background you've had, which has brought you into contact with many Jewish communities, one of the things we're reading about is this extraordinary wave of anti-Semitism in Europe as a whole, and most specifically recently in France, where anti-Semitism is overt, it is displayed with all kinds of graffiti-like swastikas and other defacement of cemeteries, synagogues, Jewish homes. And then there are Jews who are being beaten up by Muslims in France. And it doesn't seem like the establishment, the government of France, is saying this may not happen here. Again, you bring a lifetime of understanding here of Jewish life. What's your reaction when you see what's going on in Europe in general and France in particular?
Let me tell you that the governments, unfortunately, are much better than the people. And this French government, to their credit, the new French Prime Minister that a lot of Jews, very few Jews voted for, in terms of anti-Semitism, has been exemplary. I say that Europe is no longer a place where Jews have any future whatsoever. Anti-Semitism has its roots in Europe, has come back to Europe. It is now a combination of traditional anti-Semitism combined with Islamic anti-Semitism brought in by the Muslims that are there, who are responsible for much of the violence. And also, the other factor is that the left has grasped anti-Semitism and actually found a path for the ultra-right. I say that any Jew that is willing to see his children continue living a life of a pariah, and that's the life of a Jew in Europe. And unfortunately, those in the center of it, many of them, are the last to see it. They should get out now. They should leave this country, because there's no way to grow up to be a proud, normal, decent Jew in a society which is revoltingly anti-Semitic. And they're all anti-Semitic, unfortunately, and I don't think that this is an exaggeration. And believe me, the British are no better than the French. If you look at the British media, it's equally as bad, just a little bit more polite, and they don't have the same overtness. But it so happens, as I said, public opinion is the worst part of it. It's the people. You look at the Gallup poll, you look at the opinion polls in Europe, and you'd be shocked. You'll see who is the greatest threat in Europe, and they name a whole series of countries. Israel is number one, followed by North Korea and Iran perhaps, but Israel's always the top. Israel is the greatest threat to world peace. Do you like Jews? There's increasing numbers that don't like Jews. It's no longer a place for Jews to live. And now's the time. If they can't get out themselves, they should be looking for ways and means of getting their children out while they can still do so comfortably. And I believe that they will pay a price for this, Europe, because Europe is heading into dark ages if it continues in this direction.
You know, what you're saying is breathtaking. First of all, it reminds me of Jabotinsky warning Jews before the Holocaust to get out. But now you're saying that there is no place for Jews in Europe any longer. Would you ever have imagined saying that 15 years ago, 20 years ago?
25 years ago, I was part of the establishment that said anti-Semitism or anti-Semites are becoming an extinct species. This has become the greatest political growth industry. Anti-Semitism is the greatest political growth industry in the world. And what is happening in Europe is truly terrifying.
It's terrifying.
It's terrifying. And as I say, I don't see the physical threat being so great as the cultural and human living in a society where you are looked upon the way we were looked upon in the 19th century. I don't think in this open society in which we live in today, this is a place for Jews to live. And you have children in schools, if they're not going to a Jewish school, they tend to hide their Jewish identity. You have Jews who distance themselves from Israel to point somehow an anti-Zionist chic in order to not be regarded as one of these. It doesn't help them. Germany, even in Germany, of all places, the left in Germany is vile when it comes to Jews.
Boy, do you worry that it could at one time not replicate the Holocaust, but in some way lead to real physical brutality against Jews?
Well, if the Islamic extremist elements become more powerful, it will. If the extremist elements in the European areas who are Muslim and anti-Semitic, if those elements become more powerful and become a greater political force, then it's inevitably going to be, you're not going to chas v'chalila have gas chambers and mass murders, but there is brutality. You look at it. Look, when you start having boycotts of circumcision, you have outlawing circumcision, outlawing shchita. These movements, it's not coincidental. All these things are coming up. All these awful things are coming up at the same time.
If somebody said to you, but you're giving up, Isi. If you're telling people to leave Europe, you're giving up, as opposed to somehow the Jewish world standing up against this and saying, no, we have every right to be here, and you can't treat us this way, and you can't pass these laws, and you can't deface, and you certainly cannot be physically violent. And I'm wondering whether you feel that the Jewish establishment, whether it's the State of Israel, whether it's American Jewry, whether it's World Jewish Organizations, have we made this enough of an issue so that the average Jew watching you right now understands how serious this problem is, and should we be doing more?
Look, we have to fight anti-Semitism wherever it is, but I believe that it's terribly important to watch after the next Jewish generation. And for younger people to grow up in this sort of an environment, I think it's crippling. And, I don't want to see Jews, young Jews, being mentally crippled with anti-Semitism. And it is of that nature. We're going back to the pre-state period when Jews felt awkward about being Jewish. It's terrible. And there's a shame about Israel. And of course that shame is built up by the people that hate us. I feel ultimately, particularly as we have a Jewish state today, Jews should go either to Israel, which is their homeland, or to communities where they are accommodated. Unfortunately, there are less and less in the United States, Canada, Australia. There are some countries that are still, but you don't create martyrdom for children because you're fighting a cause. I don't believe in that. I believe you look after the children and save the children.
And forgive me for just extending it. Are you worried that this will spread? Do you believe that somehow this is confined to Europe? Or are you in any way saying, given the sweep of what's happened to the Jewish people over history, there's a pendulum swing here, and it's beginning in Europe, but it's going to extend to more and more places, even in the West?
Of course there's a danger of it. If you look at Canada, you have the most positive government that Israel could dream of in the Harper government. But if you look at the polls in terms of Jews and in terms of Israel, Canada's different. It's different from its government. and the people are not as good as the government. In the United States, you have a combination of factors. You have a tradition of Americans, and you also have, and here don't underestimate the element of the evangelicals, which makes a lot of Jews get excited and nervous. But they're ultimately an extraordinarily positive element as far as philo-Semitism is concerned, because putting aside the missionary nonsense, because very few of them are indulging in missionaries, many of these people are committing themselves to the Jewish people because they believe that this is the way that God will bless them and endow them and look after them. If you're good to the Jewish people, God will bless us and look after us. That's an extraordinary philosophy to find in this awful, evil world that we're living in. So, but the United States is different, and I hope it will continue to be different forever. But you have the elements, because the far left is already expressing some of these things. We talked about it beforehand.
So I want to end where we began. We began with the fact that the United States has had an election and Barack Obama is reelected. And we talked about politicians both in Israel and the United States. It may be that this is not true for you. In my mind, I say to myself, given the fact that you were a leader of Australian Jewry, that you were instrumental in helping to really save Soviet Jewry, that you were one of the first to open up the relationship between the Jewish people, the State of Israel, and China. The fact that you come here all the time and meet with, certainly in the Jewish world, some of the people who are at the highest levels of Jewish organizational life and perhaps political life as well. To what extent have you, in your personal career, had real interaction with the people who are, quote, heads of state? To what extent do you feel you have known people who have been at the seat of power, whether it's in Israel, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in China, whether it's in the United States, or is the reality that you have not had that kind of access? What is true for you?
No, I have had that kind of access, but at different levels.
Okay. To what extent do you feel that these people, the politicians, to what extent are they ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary positions of responsibility and power? To what extent do you feel that inevitably the old phrase, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that what happens to ordinary people when they become in these positions of extreme power and responsibility, that they become different, that they lose touch, and that the cynicism that some of us have for politicians of all stripes is a well-placed cynicism, or in some way is it unfair to the people who serve in high positions of office?
Look, I've got to answer that by saying two things. First of all, I think it's unfair because in a democracy, the absolute power situation simply does not apply in a democracy. They have to face electors. What is problematic for the United States, for Israel, and for Jewish communities as well, the best people are not going into political life.
Because?
That is a tragedy, because they can't stand the unpleasantness and the nasty side of the structure of political life everywhere. Their private lives are invaded. Everything that they do comes under a microscope. And they want to have it's much more pleasant to be a businessman or to be an academic or to be this. The last thing to be a politician is you have to go through fire. And unfortunately, particularly for Israel, because we need it desperately, the best people don't go into politics. Mm-hmm. A lot of better politicians, I think our Knesset and our leadership would be a lot better than it is.
You know how much I love talking to you. You know I would talk to you all day and night. And the fact that you have given me so much of your heart and your mind is one of the real gifts that I've received by doing Shalom TV and Jewish television. And I've said this before, the fact that you are now in my life is one of the most special things of all the things that have happened to me professionally. I thank you so much. I wish you kol tuva hatzlacha
Thank you.
and personal success and health
Thank you.
and goodness. And you'll just have to continue to sit with me anytime I possibly can.
You have to continue with Shalom TV because it really has the potential, I think, of changing the Jewish map in many areas, and I wish you hatzlacha there.
Thank you very, very much. There you have it, our conversation again with Isi Leibler. I really do feel he has become the leading columnist in the Jewish world, and I want all of you to make sure you receive Isi's columns on your own email system. And to do that, simply go to ileibler@leibler.com, and just, it's an email. You email him and simply say, I'd like to receive your column, and virtually every week you'll receive some of the things that Isi is thinking about and writing about, and he's also a brilliant writer. So please make sure you see as much of him as you possibly can. And his own column is called Candidly Speaking from Jerusalem. Of course, as always, I'd love to hear any thoughts or comments you have in reaction to the ideas expressed by Isi Leibler. Please be in touch with me. Email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.